A mountain man found a rejected bride chained to a tree. What he did next will make you cry. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, her wedding dress torn and her wrists bound in iron. Left to die in shame, she had no one. Until a lone mountain man rode out of the timber and cut her chains. But rescuing her was only the beginning. Whispers in town spread like wildfire about her blood, her honor, and a deed she carried that could change the fate of the valley forever. Greedy ranchers closed in. Railroad men circled like vultures, and the bride's own past threatened to bury her once more. He had lived by the rifle his whole life. Now he would have to choose mercy or violence, faith or despair, love or loneliness. And when the truth about her family is revealed, it will shake the town to its core. Can a broken mountain man and a shamed bride stand against the cruelty of a whole town and turn disgrace into redemption? Or will the frontier swallow them both? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The autumn wind whispered through the cottonwoods, rustling their golden leaves as Ronald McCready guided his horse down the narrow wagon road. His pack horse plodded behind, laden with supplies from his trading trip to town. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail, and the air held that crisp bite that warned of winter's approach. Ronald shifted in his worn leather saddle, ready to make camp before nightfall. Years of living alone in the high country had taught him to respect the mountain's rhythms, but something made him pull back on the reins, cocking his head to listen. There, carried on the wind, came a sound that didn't belong. A cry, faint but unmistakable. His horse's ears pricked forward, sensing his sudden alertness. Ronald sat motionless, weathered face intent as he tracked the sound. Another cry drifted from a stand of cottonwoods near what used to be Miller's Creek, now dried to nothing but a dusty bed in the drought. "Easy now," he murmured to his horse, turning off the main trail. The pack horse followed as they picked their way through the brush. Ronald's hand rested near his hip, years of caution making him wary of any unexpected situation. The sound grew clearer as they approached the grove. A woman's voice, weak but desperate. The rattle of metal against metal threaded through her pleas. What he found in that grove stopped him cold. A young woman was chained to one of the larger cottonwoods, her wrists bound cruelly in iron cuffs that had rubbed her skin raw. Her wedding dress, for that's what it clearly was, hung in muddy tatters around her, the white fabric soiled and torn. Dark hair had come loose from its pins to fall around a face pale with exhaustion. She looked about ready to collapse where she stood. Her eyes met his, huge with fear and desperate hope. The chain rattled as she tried to straighten herself. "Please," she whispered, her voice rough from crying out, "please help me." Ronald swung down from his saddle, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He approached slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. Up close, he could see she was trembling. Whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. "I'm Louise," she managed. "Louise Holt." Ronald nodded, already reaching for his saddlebags. "Name's McCready," he said gruffly. "Ronald McCready. Let's get you loose from there." He pulled out a heavy iron file he used for trail work. The chain was thick but shoddily made, meant more for livestock than people. Still, it took several minutes of steady work to break through a link, the metal shrieking in protest. When the chain finally gave way, Louise's legs buckled. Ronald caught her before she could hit the ground, feeling how cold she was through the thin fabric of her ruined dress. She tried to stand, but swayed dangerously. "Easy now," he said, unconsciously using the same gentle tone he'd used with his horse. "You're in no shape to walk." Without ceremony, he lifted her onto his horse, arranging her sideways in the saddle. She was light, too light, in his arms, and he could feel her shaking. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the saddle horn with fingers gone white at the knuckles. The iron cuffs still circled her wrists, though no longer chained to the tree. They'd need proper tools to remove those. Ronald gathered his horse's reins, leading them back toward the main trail. The sun was sinking fast now, painting the sky in deep purples and reds. Night would bring bitter cold at this elevation, and his cabin was a good hour's ride away. He draped his heavy wool coat around Louise's shoulders, noting how she startled at the contact before pulling the warmth closer around herself. Questions crowded his mind. Who had done this to her? Why was she in a wedding dress? But those could wait. Right now, she needed shelter and care. The light faded as they made their slow way up the mountain trail. Ronald walked beside his horse, one hand steady on the reins while the other stayed near his gun. He'd lived too long in these mountains to let his guard down, especially now. Louise sat silent in the saddle, swaying slightly with each step. Every so often, a shiver would run through her, and the iron cuffs would clink softly. Ronald found himself watching her from the corner of his eye, making sure she didn't fall. It had been years since he'd brought anyone to his cabin. After what happened in his youth, he'd chosen solitude, finding peace in the rhythm of seasons and the honest work of survival. But something about this woman's plight had cut through his carefully built walls. The cruelty of leaving someone chained like an animal, dressed for what should have been the happiest day of her life. It stirred an anger he thought he'd left behind. The evening chill deepened as they climbed higher. Their breath began to show in white puffs, and frost started forming on the horses' manes. Louise hunched deeper into his coat, but her shivering grew worse. "Not much further now," Ronald said, breaking the long silence. She nodded, but he wasn't sure she fully heard him. Her face had taken on a worrying pallor in the gathering dark. The trail switched back one final time, bringing them to the small clearing where his cabin stood. Smoke still rose from the chimney. He always banked the fire before leaving, and the sight of it brought a measure of relief. At least they'd have warmth waiting. His dog, an old blue heeler named Scout, came trotting out to meet them, tail wagging cautiously at the strange arrival. Ronald quieted him with a gesture, not wanting to frighten Louise any more than she already was. "We're here," he said, reaching up to help her down. She tried to dismount on her own, but her legs wouldn't hold her. Ronald caught her again, supporting her weight as she found her feet. "I'm sorry," she whispered, swaying against him. "I don't mean to be such a burden." "You ain't a burden," he said firmly. "Come on now, let's get you inside where it's warm." He helped her to the cabin door, careful to match his pace to her unsteady steps. Scout followed at their heels, unusually subdued, as if sensing something wasn't right. The cabin was simple but solid, built by Ronald's own hands over the years. A fire glowed in the stone hearth, and the single room was neat and clean, if sparse. A bed stood in one corner, a table and chairs in another, and shelves lined with preserves and supplies along the walls. Ronald guided Louise to the chair nearest to the fire, settling her there before turning to tend to the flames. He added several logs, building it up until warmth began to fill the space. When he looked back, Louise had slumped in the chair, eyes closed and face drawn with exhaustion. The iron cuffs still circled her wrists, an ugly reminder of what she'd endured. Ronald's jaw tightened at the sight. Whoever had done this would answer for it, but first things first. "Let's see about getting those off you," he said, moving to his tool chest. He returned with a file and a set of picks, kneeling beside her chair to examine the locks. Louise held out her hands, trying not to wince as he carefully manipulated the cuffs. The skin beneath was raw and beginning to bruise. It took several minutes of patient work, but finally the locks gave way with a click. Ronald removed the cuffs as gently as he could, setting them aside with barely contained disgust. Louise rubbed her wrists, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered again. "I didn't think. I was afraid no one would come." Ronald stood, moving to his supplies to gather what was needed for treating her injuries. "Someone always comes," he said quietly. "Might not be who you expect, but help finds its way." He returned with clean cloths, a jar of healing salve, and a cup of water. Louise accepted the water gratefully, drinking in small sips while he tended to her wrists. Neither spoke as he worked, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Outside, night had fully fallen. The wind picked up, whistling around the cabin's sturdy walls. Scout settled by the fire, keeping a watchful eye on their unexpected guest. Ronald finished bandaging Louise's wrists and stood, suddenly aware of how his presence might loom over her. He moved back, giving her space. "You need rest," he said. "Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Louise looked up at him, exhaustion warring with uncertainty in her expression. "I couldn't take your bed." "You can and you will," Ronald said firmly but not unkindly. "You're dead on your feet, and that chair won't do for sleeping." She didn't argue further, too drained to protest. Ronald helped her to the bed, turning his back while she arranged herself under the quilts, ruined wedding dress and all. When he looked back, she was already drifting off, lines of worry smoothing from her face in sleep. Ronald settled himself in the chair she'd vacated, rifle across his knees. Scout curled at his feet with a contented sigh. The fire popped and crackled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. He studied the sleeping woman, questions turning in his mind. Someone had meant her harm, serious harm, leaving her out there to die of exposure, or worse. The wedding dress suggested a story he wasn't sure he wanted to hear, but would need to know. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For now she was safe, and that would have to be enough. The cabin door creaked open as Ronald carried Louise inside, her torn wedding dress trailing across the rough-hewn floorboards. The embers in the fireplace cast a faint orange glow, barely enough to see by. Scout patted in behind them, circling anxiously as Ronald laid Louise on the bearskin rug near the hearth. "Just rest easy now," he murmured, though she seemed barely conscious. Her skin felt hot to the touch. Too hot. Fever had set in from her hours exposed to the autumn chill. Ronald moved quickly around the cabin, gathering what was needed. He struck a match to light the iron lantern, then hung it from a hook overhead. The warm light revealed Louise more clearly. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, dark circles beneath her eyes. Mud and leaves matted her dark hair, and her once white dress was filthy from the forest floor. The fire needed tending first. Ronald added kindling and small logs, carefully arranging them over the coals. Soon flames licked upward, spreading welcome heat through the cabin. He filled his copper kettle with water and hung it over the fire to heat. While the water warmed, he retrieved his medicine box from a high shelf. Inside were various herbs and remedies gathered over his years in the mountains. He selected willow bark, good for fever and pain, and measured a careful portion into a tin cup. Louise stirred restlessly on the rug, mumbling words he couldn't make out. Ronald knelt beside her, gently touching her shoulder. "Ma'am? Louise, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever. "Water," she whispered. "Please." He helped her sit up enough to sip from his canteen. She drank slowly, each swallow seeming to take great effort. When she finished, Ronald eased her back down. The kettle began to steam. He poured the hot water over the willow bark, letting it steep while he gathered clean cloths and his jar of healing salve. The bruises on Louise's wrists were ugly purple-black marks where the iron had bitten deep. Dried blood crusted around the worst spots. "I need to tend these wounds," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "The dress sleeves too tight to get at them proper. I'll have to cut it away some. Is that all right?" Louise nodded weakly. Ronald took out his knife and carefully sliced through the mud-stained fabric around her wrists. The fine white cotton parted easily under his sharp blade. As he worked, Louise began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said I wasn't pure enough to marry their son." Her words came in broken phrases between shallow breaths. "The Carters, they found out about my mother. Said I had tainted blood." Ronald's hand stilled for a moment. "Your mother?" "Cherokee." Louise's eyes filled with tears. "I never knew her. She died when I was born, but somehow they learned. Accused my father of hiding it. Said no half-breed would join their family." Anger rose hot in Ronald's chest, but he kept his movements gentle as he cleaned her wounds. "The men who chained you, they were your groom's kin?" "His brothers, Samuel and Edwin Carter." Louise shuddered. "After Thomas left me at the altar, they dragged me to the woods, said shame would drive me away, or hunger would, that no one would want me now." Ronald dipped a cloth in the cooling willow bark tea. "Here, drink this. It'll help with the fever and pain." He supported her head while she sipped the bitter brew. As he shifted her, something crinkled in the bodice of her dress. Paper, perhaps, sewn into the lining. He made note of it, but didn't investigate further. Louise needed rest more than he needed answers right now. "They're wrong, you know," he said quietly, laying her back down. "About your blood being tainted. I've known many Cherokee, honorable people, strong people. You don't hate me for it." Her voice was growing fainter as exhaustion pulled at her. "No, ma'am. Hate's what drove those men to chain you up and leave you to die. That's what's truly tainted. Louise's eyes drifted closed. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me. For believing me." Soon her breathing evened out into the rhythm of sleep. Ronald finished bandaging her wrists with careful movements, not wanting to wake her. He added another log to the fire, then pulled his rocking chair closer to the hearth. Scout settled at his feet as he laid his rifle across his knees. The lantern light cast long shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. Ronald studied Louise's sleeping face, wondering at the strange turn his solitary life had taken. He'd lived alone in these mountains for years, finding peace in the silence after the violence of his youth. Now, Providence had placed this wounded soul in his path, this woman who'd faced such cruelty on what should have been her wedding day. The Carters were a powerful family in the valley. They controlled most of the good grazing land, and their word carried weight with the townspeople. If they'd turned against Louise so viciously, she'd need protection. The thought of those men leaving her chained like an animal made his jaw clench. Through the long night hours, Ronald kept his vigil. He tended the fire, brewed more willow bark tea when Louise grew restless with fever, and watched the darkness beyond the cabin windows. Every so often, Scout's ears would prick at some night sound, but no danger approached. As the moon tracked across the sky, Ronald pondered what the morning would bring. Louise couldn't stay here indefinitely. A single woman alone with a mountain man would set tongues wagging, even if his intentions were honorable. But she clearly couldn't return to town, not with the Carters set against her. The paper hidden in her dress might hold some answers. He'd seen how carefully it was stitched in, as if she'd known she might need whatever it contained. That would have to wait for daylight, though. For now his job was to see her safely through the night. Louise slept fitfully, sometimes muttering in her fever dreams. Ronald spoke quietly to soothe her when she grew agitated, the way he might calm a frightened horse. Each time she settled back into deeper sleep. The willowbark tea seemed to be helping. Her skin felt cooler when he checked, and her breathing came easier. Scout dozed by the fire, but Ronald stayed alert. Years of hunting had taught him to sit still and patient through the dark hours. His thoughts turned to the Cherokee he'd known in his trading days. Proud people who valued honor and kinship above all. To reject someone for having their blood was worse than foolish. It was cruel. The night deepened toward dawn. Ronald added another log to the fire and settled back in his chair, rifle ready across his lap. Whatever the new day might bring, he'd made his choice when he cut Louise free from those chains. She was under his protection now, and he meant to honor that duty. A coyote's cry echoed from the distant ridges. Scout's ears twitched, but he didn't stir. Louise slept on, her face peaceful in the firelight. Ronald kept his watch, waiting for the first gray light of morning to touch the eastern sky. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin windows. Ronald had kept his vigil through the night, watching over Louise as she slept fitfully near the hearth. Now, with morning breaking, he moved quietly to prepare breakfast. Years of living alone had made him efficient in his morning routine. He stirred the banked coals and added kindling until flames licked upward. The familiar scent of wood smoke filled the cabin as he measured cornmeal into his mixing bowl. Outside, his goats bleated their morning greetings, reminding him of the day's chores ahead. The coffee pot bubbled on the stovetop while he worked the cornmeal batter. Louise stirred at the sounds and smells, her eyes fluttering open. She tried to sit up, wincing at the movement. "Easy now," Ronald said, turning from the stove. "You've had a hard night." "What time is it?" Her voice was hoarse but stronger than the night before. "Just past sunrise." He poured a cup of coffee and brought it to her. "Think you can manage some breakfast? Got cornmeal cakes coming." Louise wrapped her bandaged hands around the warm cup. "Thank you. I need to show you something important." Ronald nodded, returning to tend to the cakes on the griddle. He'd wondered about that hidden paper he'd felt in her dress. When the cakes were done, he brought 2 plates over, settling cross-legged on the floor near her. Louise set aside her coffee and reached for the torn bodice of her wedding dress. Her hands trembled as she worked at the stitching in the lining. Ronald waited patiently, watching as she drew out a folded package wrapped carefully in oilskin. "My father gave this to me before he died," she said, unwrapping the document with reverent care. He knew. He knew it might save more than just me someday. The paper was crisp and official-looking, with flowing script and a dark red seal at the bottom. Ronald recognized it as a deed even before Louise smoothed it flat on the floor between them. "It's for the spring," she explained. "The one that feeds the creek below town. Father bought the rights years ago, knowing water would become precious as more settlers came." Her finger traced the signature at the bottom. "He put it in my name, trusting I'd use it fairly when the time came." Ronald studied the document carefully. The notary's seal was one he knew well. Old Judge Matthews had signed many such papers before passing on 3 winters back. This deed was genuine, dated 5 years prior. "The Carters found out somehow," Louise continued, her voice tight with emotion. "Thomas, my intended, he told his brothers. They came to the house, demanding I sign it over before the wedding. When I refused," she touched her bruised wrists, "well, you saw what they did." Ronald's jaw clenched at the memory of finding her chained to that tree. "They feared you'd have more standing than them, with rights to the water." Louise nodded. "The valley's been dry these past 2 summers. Their cattle suffer for it. But I don't want revenge, Mr. McCready. I just want fairness, for everyone who needs the water, not just those with money or influence." "Townfolk may not welcome your claim," Ronald warned. "Carters have friends in high places." "I know." Louise's chin lifted slightly. "But it's right. Father believed that. So do I." Ronald respected the quiet determination in her voice. Here was someone who'd faced cruelty but held on to her principles. It stirred something in him, memories of his own battles against injustice before he'd retreated to his mountain solitude. "I'll help you," he said simply. "But first you need to regain your strength." Relief softened Louise's features. "Thank you. I don't want to be a burden." "No burden," Ronald assured her. "Can you walk some? Should show you around if you're staying a spell." Louise managed to stand, though she swayed slightly. Ronald steadied her with a careful hand at her elbow. He led her slowly through the cabin, showing her where he kept supplies and explaining the simple systems he'd developed over years of mountain living. Outside, the morning sun had burned away the valley mist. Ronald's small herd of goats crowded the fence, curious about the newcomer. He demonstrated how to work the hand pump that brought sweet water up from his well, and showed Louise the proper way to approach the goats for milking. "They're gentle enough once they know you," he explained, letting a young nanny sniff Louise's outstretched hand. "Just move slow and speak soft." Louise smiled as the goat pushed its head against her palm. "They're lovely creatures. Do they all have names?" "Aya, that's Daisy there. The black one's Midnight, and the spotted fellow is Scout's special friend, calls him Trouble." As if hearing his name, Scout trotted over from his morning patrol of the property. The dog circled Louise once, then sat beside her, apparently accepting her presence. Ronald noticed how she relaxed slightly at this sign of approval. They spent the morning quietly, with Ronald teaching Louise the rhythm of cabin life. She insisted on helping despite her injuries, learning to work the pump one-handed and managing to fold her torn wedding dress into a neat bundle. As evening approached, Ronald realized how different the day had felt from his usual solitary routine. Louise's presence had drawn more words from him than he'd spoken in months. Somehow it didn't feel like an intrusion, more like a gentle awakening, like spring thaw after a long winter. They shared a simple supper of beans and the leftover cornmeal cakes. Louise had recovered enough to sit at the table properly, though fatigue lined her face. The deed lay between them, a reminder of the challenges ahead. "We'll need to make plans," Ronald said, breaking their comfortable silence. "But not tonight. You need rest first." Louise nodded, touching the deed's worn edges. "I've kept this secret so long. It feels strange, having someone else know." "Some secrets are burdens better shared," Ronald replied, thinking of his own past. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's soon enough for planning." As Louise settled near the hearth for another night, Ronald lit the evening lantern and took his place in the rocking chair. Scout curled at his feet, and the familiar creaking of the chair filled the cabin. Outside, crickets sang their evening chorus. A fragile trust had formed between them, born of necessity perhaps, but growing into something more. Ronald watched the lantern light play across Louise's sleeping face and wondered how this wounded yet determined woman would change the path he'd chosen for himself. Only time would tell. Dawn broke clear and cold over the mountain cabin. Louise stood at the wooden counter, carefully mending a tear in one of Ronald's work shirts. Her bruises had faded to yellowish marks, and her hands moved steadily with a needle and thread. Through the window, she watched Ronald swing his axe, the rhythmic thud of steel against wood echoing across the yard. These past 2 days had settled into an unexpected peace. Louise had insisted on earning her keep, taking over the cooking and mending that Ronald had long neglected. This morning, a pot of venison stew simmered on the stove, filling the cabin with rich aromas of meat and wild herbs. Ronald paused in his work, straightening to wipe sweat from his brow despite the autumn chill. The woodpile had grown impressively, enough to last weeks if stored properly. Louise noticed how he glanced often toward the cabin, as if checking that she was still there, still safe. She understood his wariness. Though neither spoke of it directly, they both knew she couldn't hide in his cabin forever. The town would talk, and the Carters would eventually come looking. Near midday, Ronald came inside, brushing wood chips from his shirt. "Need to ride into town," he said, reaching for his coat. "Running low on flour and coffee." Louise's hand stilled on her mending. "Will you be long?" "Few hours there and back." He moved to the gun rack, removing a worn but well-maintained pistol. "Keep this close while I'm gone. You know how to use it?" She nodded, accepting the weapon. Her father had taught her to shoot years ago, though the weight of the gun felt strange in her hands now. Yes, but surely no one would. "Better safe than sorry." Ronald's voice was firm. "Keep Scout with you. He'll warn if anyone approaches." He hesitated, then added, "Bar the door after I leave. Don't open it unless you hear my whistle. 3 short, 1 long." Louise committed the signal to memory, touched by his careful planning. "I'll be fine," she assured him. God watches over his children, even in the wilderness. Ronald's expression softened slightly at her faith, though he made no reply. Soon she heard him riding away, Scout whining briefly at being left behind. The hours passed slowly. Louise kept busy, stirring the stew and finishing her mending. She read a few passages from the small Bible she'd kept tucked in her dress, finding comfort in familiar verses. Scout proved a faithful companion, alternating between dozing by the fire and making alert circuits of the cabin's perimeter. Meanwhile, Ronald's journey took him down the mountain trail and along the dusty road into town. The settlement had grown since his last visit, with several new buildings under construction near the church. He tied his horse outside the general store, noting how conversations hushed as he entered. Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, watched him warily as he gathered his supplies. 2 women near the dry goods whispered behind their hands, their eyes following his movements. Ronald kept his face neutral, though his jaw tightened at their obvious gossip. "Flour, coffee, and some salt," he said gruffly, placing his items on the counter. As Mrs. Peterson tallied his purchase, he caught fragments of whispered conversation from the back of the store. Living under his roof, bold as brass? That Holt girl, the one with the Cherokee blood. Shameful, taking up with a mountain man so quick after. Ronald's hands clenched briefly, but he forced them to relax. Getting angry would only feed their hunger for scandal. He paid for his goods and stepped back into the afternoon sun, loading the supplies into his saddlebags. At the livery stable, where he stopped to water his horse, the atmosphere was even less friendly. A group of ranch hands loitered near the water trough, their hostile stares following his movements. One spat in the dust near Ronald's boots. "Hear that Holt girl's carrying something that don't belong to her," the man drawled. "Some paper that could make trouble for honest folk." Ronald turned slowly, meeting the ranch hand's gaze. "Reckon a man ought to mind his own business," he said evenly. The weight of his rifle, secured to his saddle, was reassuring. The ranch hand shifted uneasily under Ronald's steady look. After a tense moment, he turned away, muttering something to his companions. Ronald mounted up and headed out of town, his back straight against the weight of watching eyes. The sun was setting by the time he reached the cabin, painting the mountains in deep purple shadows. He gave the agreed-upon whistle, 3 short, 1 long, and heard the bar lifting from the door. Louise stood in the doorway, relief clear on her face. "Welcome back," she said softly, stepping aside to let him enter. Scout greeted his master with an enthusiastic tail wag, confirming all had been quiet in his absence. Ronald unloaded his supplies while Louise served up bowls of the venison stew. They sat at the rough wooden table, the lantern between them casting warm light on their faces. For a while, they ate in companionable silence. "The town's already talking," Ronald finally said, setting down his spoon. "Word spread about where you are. And about the deed." Louise's face paled slightly, but she kept her composure. "I expected as much. Small towns have long memories and quick tongues." She straightened her shoulders. "I won't hide forever, Mr. McCready. It wouldn't be right." "No," he agreed, "but we need to be careful. The Carters have friends, and not everyone will welcome your claim to the spring." "Will you?" Louise hesitated. "Will my presence here cause trouble for you?" "I know what they must be saying." Ronald's expression hardened. "I've never much cared what town folk think. Truth is truth, no matter how folks twist it." Louise nodded, touched by his steadfast support. "Would you pray with me?" she asked quietly. "I find my courage stronger when shared in prayer." For a moment, Ronald looked uncertain. It had been years since he'd prayed with another soul, but something in Louise's gentle request broke through his usual reserve. "Been a while," he admitted, "but I reckon we could use all the help we can get." They bowed their heads there at the table while Scout dozed by the fire, and night settled over the mountains. Louise's clear voice lifted in simple, heartfelt prayer, asking for strength and wisdom in the days ahead. Ronald's own whispered, "Amen," came rough with emotion, but sincere. When they raised their heads, the cabin seemed somehow warmer, more secure against the gathering dark. Louise began clearing the dishes, humming softly, an old hymn that Ronald half remembered from his childhood. "Whatever comes," she said as she worked, "I'm grateful God led you to that cottonwood grove. Some might call it chance, but I believe it was providence." Ronald watched her move about his cabin, her presence already seeming natural in the space he'd kept solitary for so long. "Might be you're right about that," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, answered by another further up the valley. Scout's ears pricked at the sound, but he remained contentedly by the fire, accepting this new arrangement of his world. The night settled deeper around the cabin, where two souls found unexpected comfort in shared purpose and prayer. The morning dawned crisp and clear, frost glittering on the cabin's window panes. Louise stood before Ronald's cracked mirror, adjusting the rough wool shawl he had lent her. The dark fabric draped over her shoulders, offering both warmth and modesty. Her wedding dress, now cleaned of mud but still bearing the memories of that terrible day, hung in the back room. "You don't have to do this today," Ronald said from the doorway, watching her straighten her spine with determined grace. "Yes, I do." Louise turned to face him, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "Hiding only gives power to their whispers. My father taught me to walk in truth, even when the path is hard." Ronald nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. He gathered their things while Louise braided her hair neatly, using water to smooth down the stray wisps. The morning routine of feeding Scout and the goats helped calm her nerves. The ride into town took nearly 2 hours, the morning sun climbing higher as they descended the mountain trail. Louise sat straight in her saddle, borrowed from Ronald's spare tack. The regular rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a meadowlark helped steady her resolve. As they approached the outskirts of town, Louise felt her pulse quicken. Already she could see heads turning, people pausing in their tasks to stare. Ronald rode slightly ahead, his broad shoulders set protectively, though he kept a respectable distance. The whispers began as soon as they passed the first buildings. Louise kept her chin lifted, though her hands tightened on the reins. Bold as brass, showing her face, living in sin up there with that mountain man. Cherokee blood will tell. They dismounted outside the post office, tying their horses to the hitching post. Louise pulled an envelope from her pocket, a letter she had written the previous evening by lamplight. Ronald stood guard while she stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The postmaster, Mr. Jenkins, looked up and quickly away, his fingers fumbling with the papers before him. Louise approached the counter with measured steps. "I'd like to send this letter to Kansas, please," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the quiet space. She placed the envelope and coins on the counter. Mr. Jenkins took her payment without meeting her eyes, his movements stiff. 3 weeks, maybe 4 for a reply, he muttered. Thank you. Louise turned away, holding her dignity close like armor. The letter to her aunt felt like a lifeline cast into uncertain waters, though she knew how long she must wait for any response. Outside, Ronald fell into step beside her as they walked toward the white-painted house beside the church. The Reverend's home sat neat and humble, with late-blooming marigolds still bright along the path. Reverend Yates opened the door himself at their knock. His kind face showed no judgment, only concern, as he ushered them inside. Miss Holt, Mr. McCready. Please come in where we can speak privately. The parlor was simple but welcoming, warmed by a small fire. Louise sat carefully on the offered chair, while Ronald remained standing, hat in his hands. Reverend, Louise began, I've come to explain. Her voice caught briefly, but she pressed on, relating the events of her failed wedding, the cruel chaining, and the deed her father had left in her care. The preacher listened without interruption, his weathered hands folded in his lap. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I knew your father, Miss Holt, he said finally. Thomas was an upright man who loved the Lord and dealt fairly with all. He saw no difference between souls in God's eyes. The Reverend's gaze was steady. If you need my voice raised in your defense, you shall have it. The truth of your character and your father's good name stand against any malicious gossip. Relief brought tears to Louise's eyes, though she blinked them back. Thank you, Reverend. Your support means more than I can say. The path ahead may be difficult, he warned gently, but remember that our Lord sees beyond human prejudices. Keep your heart fixed on what is right. They talked a while longer, the Reverend offering counsel and prayer before they took their leave. His words of encouragement strengthened Louise's spirit as they walked toward the mercantile. The store was busy with morning shoppers when they entered. Conversations stuttered to a halt, then resumed in hushed tones. Louise moved purposefully to the dry goods counter, selecting sturdy thread for mending. Mrs. Peterson took her payment with pinched lips, dropping the coins rather than touching Louise's hand. Other customers drew back slightly as Louise passed, as though her presence might contaminate them. A young mother pulled her child closer, turning away sharply. Each small rejection stung, but Louise maintained her composure. Ronald's solid presence nearby helped, though he said nothing. He simply stood steady, his very silence a rebuke to the whispered insults and sideways glances. The ride back to the cabin seemed longer than the morning's journey. As they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the town's judgments behind, Louise felt her careful control beginning to crack. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened. Ronald noticed her struggle. He reined his horse closer, though still maintaining proper distance. You showed more courage down there than any of them, he said quietly. I feel anything but courageous, Louise admitted, her voice wavering. Their eyes, their whispers. How can people be so cruel? Fear makes folks mean, Ronald replied. Fear of what's different. Fear of losing what they think is theirs. He paused, then added, but dignity ain't given by gossips and busybodies. It's held inside, where they can't touch it. Louise wiped her eyes with the corner of the borrowed shawl. Thank you for walking beside me today, for not being ashamed to be seen with me. Ain't nothing to be ashamed of, Ronald said firmly. You're facing them honest and upright while they hide behind whispers and spite. That takes real strength. They rode on in companionable silence, the afternoon sun warming their backs. A hawk circled overhead, riding the mountain thermals with effortless grace. Louise watched it soar, drawing comfort from its freedom and the quiet acceptance of her unusual guardian. The cabin came into view as the sun began its westward slide. Scout's welcoming bark greeted them, and the familiar sight of the rough-hewn logs felt increasingly like sanctuary. Louise dismounted, her legs shaky from the long ride and emotional strain. I'll tend to the horses, Ronald said, taking her reins. You go on inside and rest a spell. Louise nodded gratefully, clutching her small package of thread. The day's trials had exhausted her, but beneath the weariness lay a core of accomplishment. She had faced the town's judgment and remained standing. With God's help, the Reverend's support, and Ronald's steady presence, perhaps she could face whatever came next. The sound of Ronald caring for the horses drifted through the cabin's walls. Familiar, comforting sounds that spoke of safety and acceptance. Louise unpacked her thread and began sorting colors, finding peace in the simple task. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she had taken the first steps toward claiming her place in the world, one difficult step at a time. The crisp autumn morning brought change to the quiet mountain town. A group of men in pristine suits descended from the eastbound stage, their polished boots and leather satchels marking them as different from the local folk. Among them stood Horace Bell, the railroad surveyor, his keen eyes already measuring the lay of the land. Word spread quickly through town. By midday, the saloon buzzed with speculation about the railroad's intentions. Ronald sat quietly in the corner, nursing a cup of coffee while he listened to the excited chatter. "Heard they're looking to lay track clean through the valley," one ranch hand declared. "Going to need plenty of water for them steam engines." "Reckon they'll pay good money for the right spot," another added, prompting knowing looks among the gathered men. Ronald's attention sharpened when he heard the name Holt mentioned at the bar. Samuel Carter, the elder of the rejected groom's brothers, was speaking in low tones with the surveyor. Edwin, the younger brother, hovered nearby, his narrow face intent. "That spring's been Carterland long as anyone can remember," Samuel was saying. "Any paper saying different ain't worth the ink it's printed with." Horace Bell nodded thoughtfully, making notes in a small leather book. "Naturally, the railroad prefers to deal with established property holders," he replied smoothly. "Less complications that way." Ronald finished his coffee and slipped out, mounting his horse for the ride home. The autumn wind carried a hint of snow, and dark clouds gathered over the distant peaks. He needed to warn Louise about what was brewing in town. He was still a mile from the cabin when he spotted two riders approaching from the south, the Carter brothers, moving fast. Ronald spurred his horse, taking a shortcut through the pines to reach home first. Louise looked up from her mending as he burst through the door. "Ronald, what's wrong?" "Carter brothers are coming," he said, reaching for his shotgun. "Railroad's in town and they're aiming to claim your spring." Louise's face paled, but she stood straight, tucking the deed deeper into her pocket. "I won't give up my father's gift," she said firmly. Hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Ronald positioned himself in the doorway, shotgun held ready but not aimed. Louise stood just behind his shoulder as Samuel and Edwin dismounted. "Come to talk business, Miss Holt," Samuel called out, his friendly tone belied by the hardness in his eyes. "Best you hand over that deed before things get uncomfortable." "That spring belongs to the Carters," Edwin added. "You've caused enough trouble already with your claims." Louise stepped forward, though Ronald kept close. "My father's signature is on that deed," she said clearly. "It's legal and true, witnessed before God and the territorial court." Samuel's face darkened. "You really want to drag this through court? Let everyone hear about your mother's people? How you tried to trick your way into a respectable family?" "Ain't no trick in honest paper," Ronald growled. "Now get off my land." Edwin's hand drifted toward his gun. "You're harboring a woman of questionable virtue, McCready. Folks might start wondering about your own reputation." "My virtue is between me and my maker," Louise declared, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "And he knows the truth of my claim." "Last chance," Samuel snarled. "Give us that deed or we'll make sure every judge from here to Kansas City knows what you really are." Ronald's finger tightened on the trigger guard. "You heard the lady. This is private property. Get moving." The brothers exchanged dark looks. Samuel spat in the dust. "This ain't over. We'll be back with the law behind us." "Law works both ways," Ronald reminded them. "Now ride." They mounted up, Edwin turning in his saddle for a final threat. "You're choosing the wrong side, McCready. That spring will be Carter land one way or another." Ronald stood in the doorway until the brothers disappeared down the trail. Only then did he lower the shotgun and turn to Louise. She had sunk into a chair, shaking. "They'll do it," she whispered. "They'll drag my mother's name through the mud, make it so no judge will even look at the deed." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Maybe Father was wrong to trust me with this. All it's brought is pain and hatred." Ronald set aside his gun and knelt beside her chair. "Your father knew what he was doing," he said gently. "Providence doesn't waste a gift. That spring could help a lot of folks if it's managed right." "I'm not strong enough," Louise sobbed. "I can't fight them alone." "You ain't alone," Ronald said firmly. "I'm standing with you, not as your keeper, but as your ally. We'll face this together." Louise looked at him through tear-blurred eyes. Why? Why risk your peace for my cause? Because it's right, Ronald answered simply. And because I've seen your heart. You don't want that spring for power or profit. You want it to help people, just like your father intended. Thunder rumbled in the distance as the storm clouds rolled closer. Ronald built up the fire while Louise wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. Will you pray with me? She asked softly. I need guidance and strength. Ronald nodded, and together they knelt by the hearth. Louise's voice trembled at first, then grew stronger as she prayed for wisdom and courage. Ronald added his own quiet, Amen, feeling something long dormant in his spirit stirring to life. The first snowflakes began to fall as darkness settled over the cabin. They drifted past the window like white feathers, gathering on the sill. Louise watched them, her face thoughtful in the firelight. Whatever comes, she said quietly, I'm grateful you're beside me. Ronald added another log to the fire, watching the flames leap up. We'll face it together, he repeated. Come what may. The fire burned low as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. Inside the cabin, two souls found strength in shared purpose and faith, preparing for the battles ahead. The deed in Louise's pocket carried not just her father's signature, but his dream of water flowing freely for all who needed it. With Ronald's support, perhaps that dream could still come true. The snow fell steadily through the night, transforming the rugged mountain landscape into a hushed white wilderness. By morning, deep drifts surrounded Ronald's cabin, the pristine blanket broken only by rabbit tracks and the occasional deer path. The storm had effectively closed off the higher trails, creating a peaceful isolation that both occupants secretly welcomed. Ronald adapted his daily routines to accommodate their shared living space. He rose before dawn, banking the fire that Louise had kept burning through the night. The familiar crunch of snow under his boots became a morning ritual as he checked his trap lines, returning with rabbits for their pot. Louise proved herself an able partner in their small household. She maintained order in the cabin with quiet efficiency, her hands always busy with some useful task. The simple rhythm of their days brought a calm that helped heal the wounds of her public rejection. One particularly cold evening, as wind whistled through the pine boughs outside, Louise reached into her worn carpet bag and withdrew a small, leather-bound book. Ronald, cleaning his rifle by the fire, noticed how tenderly she handled it. My mother's testament, she explained, running her fingers over the worn cover. She taught me to read both languages side by side, Cherokee and English. Her voice held pride, mixed with lingering grief. She said understanding both would help bridge two worlds. Ronald set aside his rifle, intrigued. Would you read some? He asked, surprising himself with the request. Louise opened the book carefully, its pages soft with use. The lamplight cast a warm glow as she began reading, her voice clear and steady. The familiar words of psalms and parables took on new meaning in the quiet cabin, especially when she softly spoke the Cherokee translations that followed. Ronald found himself drawn in, memories stirring of his own mother reading scripture by candlelight long ago. He had pushed faith aside during his years of solitary trapping, trusting only in his rifle and wilderness skills. But listening to Louise read, something long dormant began to stir in his heart. Night after night they fell into this pattern. Louise would read while Ronald listened, the fire crackling between them. Sometimes she would pause to share her mother's teachings about the stories, revealing a deep wisdom that transcended any single culture. One evening, after closing the testament, Louise spoke softly about her mother's views on the natural world. She taught me that water, like air and sunlight, belongs to all living things, not just to those with power or paper claims. She twisted her hands in her lap. She said our duty is to protect it for everyone, even those who might hate us. Ronald was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. I used to reckon my rifle was all the protection and power I needed, he admitted. Lived by my own rules, kept to myself. He glanced at Louise. But finding you chained to that tree, maybe God had a bigger purpose in mind for both of us. Louise met his gaze, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Do you really believe that? Starting to, he replied honestly. Your faith, it reminds me of things I tried to forget. Their conversations deepened over the following days, moving beyond mere courtesy to genuine understanding. Ronald found himself sharing stories of his trapping days, while Louise spoke of her father's dreams for the valley's future. When the storm finally cleared, leaving the world sparkling under a bright blue sky, Ronald suggested they ride to see the spring itself. Louise agreed eagerly, wanting to finally view the source of so much conflict. They set out early the next morning, Louise warmly wrapped in Ronald's spare coat. The journey took several hours, their horses picking carefully through the snow-covered trails. Ronald led them south, then east, following a route he knew well from his hunting trips. By early afternoon, they approached a rocky rise where several cottonwoods stood sentinel. Ronald helped Louise dismount, then guided her up a narrow path between the rocks. At the top, they paused, and Louise caught her breath. Clear water bubbled up from between the rocks, forming a small pool before trickling down the hillside. Even in winter, the spring flowed strong and pure, the water so clear they could see every pebble at the bottom. Louise approached slowly, almost reverently. Kneeling in the snow, she dipped her fingers in the icy water. "It's beautiful," she whispered, just as Father described it. Ronald stood nearby, scanning the valley below with experienced eyes. "Railroad will want this bad once they know about it," he warned. "Steam engines need water, and there's no better source for miles around." Louise withdrew her hand from the spring, her expression determined. When I win my claim," she corrected herself firmly. "This water will serve the whole community, not just the highest bidder." She stood brushing snow from her skirts. That's what Father wanted. Not profit, but provision for all who need it. Ronald studied her face, seeing not the frightened woman he'd rescued, but someone with the strength and vision to stand against powerful forces. Her commitment to serving others, even those who had wronged her, spoke of a courage deeper than mere defiance. "That's a noble purpose," he said quietly. "Won't be an easy fight." "No," Louise agreed, looking out over the snow-covered valley. "But it's the right one." She turned to face him fully. "Will you help me protect it? Not just from those who would steal it, but for those who need it most?" Ronald felt the weight of her question, understanding she was asking for more than just physical protection. She was inviting him to share in a purpose larger than himself, to believe in something beyond mere survival. "I will," he promised, and meant it. They stayed by the spring a while longer, Louise marking the lay of the land in her mind while Ronald kept watch. The winter sun hung low in the sky when they finally mounted up for the ride home. As they rode, Louise spoke of her plans, providing water for small farmers who couldn't dig deep wells, ensuring traveling families could refill their barrels, maybe even helping the town grow in a way that benefited everyone, not just the wealthy ranchers. Ronald listened, impressed by her practical wisdom. She wasn't just holding on to her father's dream, she was building on it, making it her own. The quiet strength he'd first glimpsed in her was blooming into something remarkable. They reached the cabin as dusk was falling, the temperature dropping sharply. While Ronald tended to the horses, Louise built up the fire and prepared their evening meal. The familiar routine felt different now, charged with new purpose. Over supper, they discussed what steps they would need to take to protect Louise's claim. The railroad men would return soon, and with them, new challenges. But as they sat in the warmth of the fire, reading again from the Testament, both felt better prepared for whatever lay ahead. The spring's clear water had shown them a reflection of something larger than themselves, a vision of justice tempered with mercy, of strength found in serving others. It was a purpose worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. As night settled over the cabin, the snow began falling again, softly this time, as if nature itself was blanketing their resolve in quiet blessing. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had found their shared purpose, as clear and pure as the spring itself. A week of anxious waiting passed like molasses in winter. The summons finally arrived by messenger. Town officials had called a hearing to review Louise's deed. The courthouse would convene at 10 o'clock sharp the following morning. Louise spent the evening preparing her father's document with trembling hands. She wrapped it carefully in clean linen, then tucked it into her mother's Bible for safekeeping. Ronald watched her from across the cabin, noting how she traced her fingers over the scripture-filled pages as if drawing strength from their familiar words. "We should leave early," Ronald said, checking the wagon's wheels one final time before darkness fell. "Road might be rough after the snow." Louise nodded, her face pale but determined in the lamplight. "I'll be ready before dawn." Morning came crisp and clear. They set out just as the sun's first rays painted the mountain peaks gold. Louise sat straight-backed beside Ronald on the wagon seat, the Bible clutched tightly in her lap. Neither spoke much during the long descent into town, each lost in their own thoughts as the wagon wheels creaked over frozen ruts. They reached town while most folks were still at breakfast. Ronald helped Louise down from the wagon, steadying her when her boots slipped on the icy street. Already, curious faces peered through frosted windows as they made their way to the courthouse. The building stood 2 stories tall, its red brick severe against the winter sky. Inside, the wood-paneled hearing room smelled of lamp oil and tobacco. Louise and Ronald found seats near the front, while behind them, townspeople filed in quietly, their boots echoing on the plank floor. Judge Harrison entered promptly at 10 o'clock, his black robe swishing as he took his seat behind the raised desk. He was a lean man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, though his expression revealed nothing as he called the hearing to order. Samuel and Edwin Carter sat with their lawyer on the opposite side of the room. They had dressed in their finest clothes, but their faces were hard as they glared at Louise. Behind them sat Horace Bell, the railroad surveyor, watching the proceedings with calculating interest. "We're here to review the validity of a deed," Judge Harrison announced, shuffling through his papers. "Concerning the natural spring on the south quarter of Section 23. Miss Holt, please present your document." Louise rose slowly, clutching the Bible. Her voice was soft but steady as she approached the judge's desk and carefully removed the deed. "This is my father's signature, Your Honor, witnessed and notarized 3 years ago." The judge examined the paper carefully while the room held its breath. "And you claim sole ownership through inheritance?" "Yes, sir. Father left it to me before he passed, knowing water would become precious as more families settled here." The Carter brothers' lawyer stood then, straightening his vest. "Your Honor, we challenge the legitimacy of this deed based on the mental state of the signatory at the time of execution." Louise's fingers tightened on the Bible as the lawyer called his first witness. More townspeople entered, filling the back of the room as testimony began. "Holt was a drunk," declared the livery stable owner, twisting his hat in his hands. "Saw him staggering plenty of times, especially near the end." "Couldn't hardly write his own name some days," added another witness, a shopkeeper who wouldn't meet Louise's eyes. One by one they came forward, painting a picture of a man lost to spirits and unfit to manage his affairs. Louise sat perfectly still through it all, though Ronald could see how each word struck her like a physical blow. When the last witness stepped down, Louise stood again. The room grew quiet as she faced the judge, her voice clear despite the tears she held back. "My father was a God-fearing man who worked hard all his life," she said firmly. "Yes, he struggled with drink after Mother died, but he never lost his faith or his sense of duty." She opened the Bible, revealing carefully preserved papers within. "Here are his temperance pledges from the church. Here are letters he wrote me, steady and clear. He knew exactly what he was doing when he secured that spring for the future." Ronald watched her with growing admiration. The trembling girl he'd found chained to a tree was gone, replaced by a woman of quiet strength and dignity. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. McCready, you've been in these parts a long while. Did you know John Holt?" Ronald stood, conscious of all eyes turning to him. "I did, Your Honor. Met him at a revival meeting a few years back. He spoke to me about his hopes for the valley's future, how that spring could help families prosper if managed right." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Man was clear-headed and purposeful that day, quoted scripture better than the preacher." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrison studied the deed again, holding it up to the light. "The notary's seal appears genuine, though I'd prefer to verify it with county records." He set the paper down deliberately. "I'll need time to review all evidence before making a final determination." "Your Honor," Horace Bell stood suddenly, his voice smooth as silk. "The railroad might offer a solution that would satisfy all parties. The judge raised an eyebrow. Go on? Bell approached Louise, smiling confidently. Miss Holt, regardless of how this hearing concludes, pursuing your claim will be difficult. His meaning was clear in the way his eyes flicked to the hostile faces in the crowd. The railroad is prepared to purchase the deed outright at a very generous price. It would save considerable trouble for everyone involved. Louise didn't hesitate. My father's word is not for sale, Mr. Bell. This spring was meant to serve the community, not line anyone's pockets. Be reasonable, Bell pressed. Progress is coming whether you like it or not. The railroad needs that water. And families need it more, Louise replied firmly. I won't dishonor father's wishes by selling to the highest bidder. A few voices in the crowd murmured approval while others scoffed openly. Judge Harrison rapped his gavel for order. I'll review the evidence and issue my finding in due course, he declared. This hearing is adjourned. People began filing out as dusk gathered beyond the windows. Louise carefully returned the deed to her Bible, her hands steady despite the whispers and stares around her. Ronald stepped close, ready to shield her from any confrontation. Edwin Carter shouldered past them, muttering, Ain't fitting for a half-breed to hold decent folks' future hostage. Louise flinched but kept her chin high as Ronald guided her through the crowd and out into the gathering darkness. Their wagon waited where they'd left it, frost already forming on the seat. The ride home was silent save for the creak of harness leather and the hollow sound of hooves on frozen ground. Stars emerged one by one overhead, bright and cold in the winter sky. Louise held the Bible tight against her chest as if protecting more than just paper within its pages. It wasn't until they reached the cabin after Ronald had seen to the horses and Louise had built up the fire that either of them spoke of what had happened. I've never seen such courage, Ronald said quietly, watching her arrange kindling in the hearth. Standing firm against all those lies about your father. Louise paused, firelight catching the unshed tears in her eyes. I couldn't let them destroy his memory along with everything else they've taken. She brushed her hands on her skirt and stood. But I'm afraid it won't be enough. The judge seemed swayed by their witnesses. Truth has a way of coming out, Ronald assured her, and you've shown folks you won't be bullied or bought. He stepped closer, his voice gentle. Your father would be proud of how you spoke today. Louise managed a small smile, though weariness showed in every line of her body. Thank you for speaking up about him. I didn't expect anyone else to remember him as he truly was. Some of us remember, Ronald said, and some are starting to see you've got right on your side whether they admit it yet or not. Now they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, both too tired for much conversation. But as Louise prepared for bed, she paused by the fire where her father's deed lay safe within the Bible's pages. Whatever the judge decides, she said softly, I won't give up what Father entrusted to me. The spring belongs to the future, to all the families who'll need it. No railroad money can change that truth. Ronald nodded, understanding that her words were both promise and prayer. The hearing might have ended without resolution, but Louise's quiet determination had shown everyone present what true strength looked like. It wasn't found in threats or bribes or even legal papers, but in standing firmly for what was right, no matter the cost. Outside, the winter wind sang through pine branches, while inside the cabin, faith and courage kept the darkness at bay. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had done what needed doing, and done it well. The morning after the hearing, a gentle knock at the cabin door startled Louise from her mending. Ronald reached for his rifle, but lowered it when they heard a familiar voice. It's Martha Jenkins, dears, brought you some fresh bread. Louise opened the door to find the widow standing there, a covered basket in her arms and sympathy in her eyes. The older woman's face creased with concern as she took in Louise's tired appearance. No one deserves what they did to you, child, Widow Jenkins said firmly, pressing the basket into Louise's hands. The warm scent of sourdough filled the cabin. Chaining a person like some animal. It ain't Christian no matter what blood runs in their veins, and Louise's eyes welled with tears at this simple kindness. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. Martha, please. The widow patted her hand. There's apple butter in there too. Made it fresh yesterday. Ronald nodded his thanks from where he stood by the hearth. The widow's visit marked the first time anyone from town had come calling since Louise arrived. Later that afternoon, while Ronald was out checking his trap lines, A young farmhand named Timothy appeared at the woodpile. Without a word, he began splitting logs, the rhythmic thunk of his axe filling the crisp air. When Ronald returned, he found the wood neatly stacked and Timothy wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "Reckon Miss Louise speaks true about that spring," the young man muttered, not meeting Ronald's eyes. "My pa says her father was an honest man, whatever folks say now." He shouldered his axe and trudged away before Ronald could respond. These small gestures of support warmed their spirits, but darkness lurked at the edges. 3 nights later, the crash of breaking glass jolted them both awake. Ronald grabbed his rifle while Louise lit the lamp with shaking hands. A rock lay among the shattered window pieces wrapped in a crude note. Louise read it aloud, her voice barely steady. "Leave or be buried." Ronald's face hardened as he studied the jagged stone. "I'll board up the window come morning. You should sleep by the hearth tonight, away from the draft." But Louise stood straight, crumpling the note in her fist. "I will not run," she declared. "This land was my father's dream for the future. I won't abandon it to threats." Each night after that, Ronald patrolled the ridge around the cabin, his lantern casting long shadows through the trees. The weight of his rifle felt familiar in his hands. Too familiar. The old instincts from his trapping days stirred. Watch, wait, strike first. He caught himself imagining what he'd do if he caught the cowards who threatened Louise. These dark thoughts must have shone on his face when Reverend Yates visited the next afternoon. The circuit preacher studied Ronald carefully as they talked on the porch. "Guard your heart, brother," the Reverend advised quietly. "Rage is a poison that kills the soul before it reaches its target." Ronald gripped the porch railing. How can a man of God stand by while evil men threaten an innocent woman? "By remembering that vengeance belongs to the Lord," Reverend Yates answered. "Your task is to protect, not punish. There's a difference." The preacher's words echoed in Ronald's mind that Sunday when Louise announced she wanted to attend services. "Are you certain?" he asked, concerned about how she'd be received. "I won't hide from God's house," she replied simply. The little church was already full when they arrived. Heads turned as Ronald escorted Louise to a pew near the back. Some people deliberately turned away, while others whispered behind their hands. But Widow Jenkins smiled warmly, and Timothy gave a slight nod. Louise held her head high through the hymns, her clear voice joining the congregation despite the stares. Ronald sat protective beside her, aware of every muttered comment, every sideways glance. Yet pride swelled in his chest at her quiet courage. When Reverend Yates preached about Joseph forgiving his brothers, Ronald couldn't help noticing how the message seemed aimed at their situation. The Reverend's eyes found them more than once as he spoke of mercy triumphing over vengeance. After the final hymn, several people approached to greet Louise. Most were older women who remembered her father, or young families who used the spring. Their words were cautious but kind. "Good to see you in God's house, Miss Holt. Your father always spoke well of you. That spring water helped my Betty through her fever last summer." But not everyone was welcoming. The Carter brothers stood outside with their wives, whispering and pointing as Ronald helped Louise into the wagon. Their words carried clearly in the cold air. "Living in sin up there, mark my words, or probably bewitched him with her Indian ways." Ronald's hands tightened on the reins, but Louise touched his arm gently. "Let them talk," she murmured. "God knows the truth." The ride home was quiet, both lost in thought as the wagon creaked through fresh snow. Louise broke the silence as they crested the final hill to the cabin. "Thank you for coming with me today," she said softly. "I couldn't have faced them alone." Ronald helped her down from the wagon. "You're not alone anymore," he replied gruffly, surprising himself with the truth of those words. Inside, Louise bustled about preparing their Sunday dinner while Ronald tended the horses. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow, despite the broken window. The scent of baking cornbread and simmering beans filled the air when he returned. They ate by lamplight, sharing Widow Jenkins's bread and apple butter. Louise spoke of the kindness they'd been shown, finding hope in each small gesture of support. Ronald watched her across the table, struck by how naturally she'd become part of his solitary life. As she cleared the dishes, Louise paused by his chair. "I mean it, Ronald. Thank you for standing by me through all this. Most men would have turned me away that first night." He stared into the fire, remembering the frightened woman he'd found chained to a tree. That seemed like a lifetime ago now. Most men never get the chance to do what's right, he said finally. I reckon the good Lord knew what he was about, leading me down that road that day. Louise's hand rested briefly on his shoulder before she returned to her tasks. Ronald remained by the fire, listening to her quiet movements, feeling the familiar ache of loneliness ease for the first time in years. Outside, snow began falling again, dusting the window ledge with white. The broken pane was a reminder of the threats they faced, but inside the cabin, warmth and peace held sway. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together. The telegram arrived on a bitter December morning. Snow had drifted against the telegraph office, and the operator's fingers were stiff with cold as he transcribed the message. Word spread quickly through town. The judge would delay her decision on Louise's deed until spring, citing ongoing consultations with railroad interests. Ronald discovered the news while collecting supplies at the general store. He stood silent by the pot-bellied stove, listening as men discussed it over coffee and tobacco. Railroads got deep pockets, old Pete Thompson muttered, deeper than any of us common folk. The ride back to the cabin seemed longer than usual, the winter wind cutting through Ronald's heavy coat. How could he tell Louise they faced months more uncertainty? The past weeks had been hard enough. He found her in the barn tending to the goats. Wisps of hay clung to her shawl, and her cheeks were pink from exertion. She took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. The judge won't rule until spring, Ronald said quietly. Railroad men have been bending his ear. Louise's hand stilled on the pitchfork. For a moment she said nothing, just watched steam rise from the animal's breath in the cold air. Then we endure, she finally replied. The Lord gives us strength for each day. The next weeks fell into a rhythm of survival. Dawn found them breaking ice in water barrels and feeding livestock. Ronald repaired storm damage to the roof, while Louise preserved what remained of their fall harvest. They worked side by side, mending fences that heavy snow had crushed, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Some days the work felt endless, their hands grew chapped and raw despite wool gloves. The cabin's warmth became their refuge as bitter winds howled outside. Yet even in hardship, small graces appeared. One evening, as Ronald returned from checking his trap lines, Louise met him with something hidden behind her back. Her eyes held a glimmer of excitement despite her weariness. Close your eyes, she instructed. Ronald raised an eyebrow but complied. He heard the rustle of fabric, then Louise's voice. Now look. In her hands was his old work shirt, the one torn nearly beyond repair months ago. But this was not the same garment. Every tear had been carefully mended with tiny, even stitches. The worn collar had been expertly replaced and the cuffs strengthened with double layers of fabric. I've been working on it between other tasks, Louise explained softly. The light wasn't always good enough for such fine work, but she gestured to the neat rows of stitching. Ronald ran his rough fingers over the repairs, touched beyond words by the hours of patient labor they represented. Thank you, he managed finally. I've never had anything mended so fine. Louise smiled, pleased by his reaction. It's the least I can do after all you've done for me. You owe me nothing, Ronald said firmly. He hesitated, then added, having you here, it's changed everything. The cabin grew quiet, save for the crackle of the fire. Louise's hands twisted in her skirt. I don't want your pity, she whispered, or to be a burden you feel honor-bound to shelter. Pity? Ronald's voice was gruff with emotion. No, Louise. What I feel watching you face each day with courage, seeing your kindness even to those who wronged you, hearing you pray for guidance instead of vengeance. He drew a deep breath. It's not pity that moves my heart. Louise's eyes glistened in the firelight. What are you saying, Ronald? He stepped closer, taking her work-roughened hands in his. I'm saying I love your spirit, your grace, the way you've brought light back into this dark cabin. His voice grew hoarse. But I won't ask for vows made under duress when you're dependent on my protection. That wouldn't be honorable. No, Louise agreed softly. We both carry too many wounds still, and there's the spring to consider and the railroad schemes. She squeezed his hands. But perhaps Perhaps we could promise to remain open to what Providence intends? To see if what we feel now might grow into something lasting? Ronald nodded slowly. If God wills it, I would be proud to build a future with you. A family when the time is right. Then that's our promise, Louise whispered, not made in haste or fear, but in hope. Ronald released her hands and crossed to the fireplace. From behind a loose stone in the chimney, he withdrew something wrapped in faded cloth. Louise watched curiously as he unwrapped it. It was a small wooden cross, simply carved but beautiful in its weathered way. Dark with age, it bore traces of careful polishing from years of handling. My mother's, Ronald explained quietly. She read scripture to us children every night, holding this. After she died, I was so angry at God that I hid it away. His fingers traced the worn wood. But maybe it's time it blessed a home again. With reverence, he mounted the cross above the hearth. Louise touched it gently, tears spilling down her cheeks. Thank you for sharing this with me, she whispered, for trusting me with something so sacred. Ronald's hand found hers again as they stood before the fire. Outside, snow fell steadily, and wind rattled the patched window. But inside the cabin, warmth bloomed like early spring. They spoke little more that evening, but their silence held comfort. Louise worked on her mending while Ronald cleaned his rifle. The familiar tasks felt different now, rich with shared purpose. Later, adding wood to the fire for the night, Ronald watched Louise reading her mother's testament by lamplight. Her lips moved silently over the Cherokee words alongside the English ones. The cross above the hearth cast subtle shadows on the wall. Winter's grip would not ease for months. The railroad men would continue their scheming, and townsfolk their gossip. But hope had taken root in the cabin's warm soil. Like the spring waiting beneath frozen ground, it would endure until its season came. The first signs of spring whispered through the mountain valleys. Patches of bare earth emerged from melting snow, and morning birdsong replaced winter's silence. But with the thaw came renewed tension. Ronald loaded his pack horse early one March morning, preparing for a supply run to his old trap lines. Louise watched from the cabin door, her shawl pulled tight against the lingering chill. I should be back before sundown, Ronald said, checking his saddle straps. Keep the doors bolted. Be careful, Louise replied. The Carter brothers were seen riding these trails yesterday. Ronald nodded grimly, touching the revolver at his hip. The weapon felt heavy, a reminder of darker days he'd hoped to leave behind. But the brothers' threats had grown bolder as winter waned. The mountain trail wound through stands of pine and aspen. Melting snow made the footing treacherous. Ronald kept his horse at a steady walk, senses alert for anything unusual. Around midday, he reached his first trap line. The crack of a branch was his only warning. Hold right there, McCready! Samuel Carter's voice rang out from behind a boulder. Ronald's horse snorted, dancing sideways. Through the trees, he glimpsed two riders. The Carter brothers had positioned themselves on either side of the trail, rifles ready. What do you want? Ronald's hand stayed clear of his weapon, though his muscles tensed. Edwin Carter urged his mount forward. You know what we want, that deed the Holt girl's been flashing around. Hand it over, and we'll let you ride away clean. The deed's not mine to give, Ronald replied evenly, and you boys are trespassing. Samuel's laugh was ugly. Awful protective of that half-breed, ain't you? Maybe you've developed a taste for. Watch your mouth, Ronald cut in, his voice deadly quiet. Or what? Samuel swung down from his saddle, drawing his pistol. You going to stop us both? Ronald's years in the mountains had taught him to move fast. As Samuel's gun cleared leather, Ronald was already diving from his horse. He hit the ground rolling as a shot cracked overhead. Edwin's horse reared at the gunfire, throwing its rider. Ronald surged up, tackling Samuel before he could fire again. They crashed together into the mud, wrestling for control of the weapon. Samuel was younger, but Ronald's strength was honed by years of mountain life. He slammed the man's gun hand against a rock until the pistol fell. They grappled in the melting snow, trading wild punches. A horse's whinny pierced the struggle. Ronald, stop! Louise's voice rang out clear as a bell. She sat astride her mare at the trail's bend, her father's old rifle steady in her hands. Ronald had Samuel pinned, fist drawn back. The man's nose was bleeding, his eyes wide with fear. Edwin was nowhere in sight. He'd fled into the timber during the fight. He tried to kill me, Ronald growled, chest heaving. But he failed, Louise said firmly. Don't stain your hands with his blood. We're better than that. The mountain air hung still. Ronald's knuckles whitened as he fought against years of survival instinct. Finally, he lowered his fist. Get up, he ordered Samuel, stepping back. Take your horse and go. But hear this. Come near my property again, come near Louise again, and I won't be so merciful. Samuel scrambled to his feet, snatching up his fallen pistol. His face was a mask of hatred and humiliation. This ain't over, he spat, swinging onto his horse. You'll regret this, both of you. He wheeled his mount around and galloped away. Ronald stood breathing hard, watching until the rider disappeared. Then he turned to Louise. You shouldn't have followed me. I couldn't let you face them alone. She dismounted, touching his bruised knuckles gently. Thank you for showing mercy. Ronald's jaw clenched. I wanted to kill him, the old me would have. But you didn't, Louise said softly. That's what matters. And they rode home together, alert for any sign of the brothers' return. The cabin felt like a sanctuary when they finally reached it. While Louise heated water for coffee, Ronald paced restlessly. I lost control back there, he admitted, staring into the fire. When he insulted you, all I saw was red. Louise handed him a steaming cup. But you found control again. Violence would have destroyed everything we're working for. The spring, the deed, our future. She touched his arm. We must stay true to what's right, even when others choose wrong. Ronald nodded slowly. The coffee's warmth seemed to ease something tight in his chest. You're right. But I don't trust them to learn the same lesson. His words proved prophetic. 3 days later, they heard whispers in town of the Carter brothers plotting revenge. The storekeeper's wife pulled Louise aside while she shopped, warning her to watch her back. Even Reverend Yates seemed worried, suggesting they stay with his family until things settled. But Louise refused to hide. This is our home, she told Ronald that evening. We can't let fear rule us. So they maintained their routine, though with added precautions. Ronald reinforced the cabin's door and window shutters. He taught Louise to use his spare revolver, though she preferred her father's rifle. They took turns keeping watch through the night, listening for hoofbeats or footsteps in the dark. Yet they refused to let anxiety consume them. When the soil began to warm, Louise suggested planting an early crop of beans. The almanac says it's time, she explained, showing Ronald the dog-eared pages. And we need to eat, whether the Carters threaten us or not. So they worked the earth together, breaking up the thawing ground with hoes and marking neat rows with string. Louise had saved seeds from her father's garden, wrapped carefully in muslin. These are Cherokee black beans, she told Ronald as they planted. My mother's people grew them for generations. They're hardy. They'll sprout even in cold soil. Ronald watched her hands press each seed into the dark earth, covering them gently. Despite everything, she was choosing to nurture new life here. Her quiet courage humbled him. They finished planting as the sun set behind the mountains. Louise stood brushing dirt from her skirts, surveying their work with satisfaction. In a few weeks, green shoots will break through, she said. No matter what comes, something good will grow here. Ronald slipped his arm around her shoulders, and together they watched darkness settle over their newly planted field. The night air carried a hint of spring warmth, a promise of renewal. Inside the cabin, they bolted the door and checked their weapons as had become habit. But they also read scripture together by lamplight, and Louise hummed hymns while mending. Their resolve had been tested by violence and strengthened by choosing a better path. Later, adding wood to the fire, Ronald glanced at Louise. She was writing in her journal, recording the day's planting. Her face was peaceful despite their circumstances. He thought of how close he'd come to bloodshed on the trail, and how her voice had pulled him back. Perhaps that was its own kind of strength. Not the power to defeat an enemy, but the courage to show mercy instead. The cabin creaked in a gust of wind, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called. They were not safe, not yet. But they were choosing to live by their principles, to plant seeds of hope even in uncertain soil. Whatever the Carter brothers planned, that choice could not be taken from them. Spring brought a riot of wildflowers to the mountain slopes. Purple lupines swayed in warm breezes, and meadowlarks trilled their morning songs. But the changing season also stirred up trouble in town like silt in a creek bed. The railroad survey crew returned as soon as the passes cleared. Their wagons rattled down Main Street loaded with theodolites and measuring chains. Horace Bell, the railroad's land agent, took rooms at the hotel and began making his rounds. "Progress is coming, friends," he announced in the saloon, buying drinks freely. "This valley won't stay sleeping much longer. Those who get in early will prosper." His words sparked eager discussions about property values and shipping rates. But when talk turned to water rights, Bell grew cagey. "That spring up north is key to our plans," he admitted to the Carter brothers over whiskey. "Shame about that contested deed. Perhaps you boys could help resolve that situation?" Edwin Carter leaned forward. "We're working on it, but that mountain man McCready guards the Holt girl like a wolf." "Then find a way around him," Bell suggested smoothly. "The railroad rewards those who clear its path." News of the judge's return reached Ronald's cabin on a warm afternoon. Louise was hanging laundry while Ronald split logs for the cook stove. The telegraph operator's son rode up on his pony, waving an envelope. "Pa says to tell you, hearing's set for next Tuesday," the boy called out. "Judge wants all parties there by 9 o'clock sharp." Louise's hands trembled as she opened the message. 1 week, she whispered. "After all this waiting." Ronald drove his axe into a stump and wiped his brow. "Then we'd best get ready. Time to gather those letters from your father's friends." They spent the next days preparing their case. Louise visited elderly neighbors who remembered her father's temperance work. Each one wrote a statement affirming his character and sobriety. Their spidery signatures testified to years of shared community. Reverend Yates proved especially helpful. He opened his church records, showing how Louise's father had served as deacon and Sunday school teacher. "I'll speak to his good name myself," the preacher promised. "No man who lived as he did deserves to have his last wishes trampled." Louise copied relevant passages from her father's journal into clear script. The entries showed his careful planning for the spring, measuring flow rates through seasons, marking safe drinking spots, even sketching ideas for a public watering trough. "He thought of everything," Ronald said, reading over her shoulder. "This was no drunkard's rambling." The evening before the hearing, Louise sat at their table copying the last documents. Golden sunlight slanted through the window as she worked. Ronald stepped outside to split more wood for the night, the steady thunk of his axe echoing off the hillside. The cabin door burst open with a crash. Before Louise could rise, rough hands seized her arms. Edwin Carter pressed a cloth over her mouth while Samuel yanked her from the chair. "Not one sound," Edwin hissed. "We're taking a little ride." Louise struggled, but the brothers' grip was iron. They dragged her outside to waiting horses, keeping low behind the cabin wall. Ronald's axe still rang in the distance. They bound her hands and lifted her onto Edwin's saddle. As they spurred their mounts down the back trail, Louise heard Ronald's voice calling her name. But they were already galloping into deepening shadows. The ride seemed endless. They followed deer paths and dry stream beds, avoiding the main roads. Louise's arms ached from the ropes, and fear churned in her stomach. But she forced herself to memorize their route. Left at the lightning-struck pine, through the meadow of blue lupines, past 3 tall rocks like sentinels. Finally, they reached a tumble-down line shack near the disputed spring. The brothers hustled her inside, tying her to a chair beneath the sagging roof. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the walls. "Comfortable?" Samuel sneered. "You can thank your own stubbornness for this. Should have sold that deed when you had the chance." "The hearing's tomorrow," Edwin added. "Shame you'll miss it. Judge'll have to rule without you." Louise lifted her chin. "The truth will still stand. You can't hide it forever." "Watch us," Samuel growled. But Edwin laid a hand on his arm. "Leave her. McCready will be searching the main trails. We need to lead him away from here." They mounted up and rode into the darkness, hoofbeats fading to silence. Louise tested her bonds, but the ropes held fast. The empty shack creaked around her. Fear threatened to overwhelm her spirit, but then she remembered her mother's teachings. In the darkest hours, prayer could still light the way. Taking a shaky breath, she began to speak aloud. "Dear Lord, give me strength in this trial. Watch over Ronald as he searches. Guide his steps to find me, but keep his heart from hatred." Outside in the mud, Ronald knelt by the shack's wall. He had tracked the brothers' trail for hours, pushing his horse to its limits. Now, hearing Louise's trembling prayers, his hand tightened on his rifle stock. Part of him burned to burst in shooting. The brothers deserved no mercy after this. But Louise's words reached something deeper in his soul. She was praying not for vengeance, but for peace. Ronald bowed his head, joining her petition. Lord, help me choose a better way. Show me how to end this without blood. Inside, Louise continued praying through her tears. Her voice carried on the night wind, a beacon of faith in the darkness. Ronald listened and waited, and asked for wisdom to meet this moment with grace instead of rage. The moon sailed higher, casting silver light through the broken roof. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called a lonely note. And still they prayed. The woman bound but unbroken, the man kneeling in the mud, both seeking strength to face whatever morning might bring. Dawn crept over the eastern ridges, painting the sky in wisps of pink and gold. Dew sparkled on the spring grass as Ronald made his final preparations. He had spent the night in silent vigil, listening to Louise's prayers and watching the brothers take turns guarding the shack. Setting his rifle against a tree, Ronald drew out the worn family Bible from his saddlebag. Inside lay the letter he had discovered days ago, hidden in Louise's father's careful hand. The pages felt smooth beneath his calloused fingers as he walked slowly toward the shack's weathered door. The hinges creaked as he entered. Morning light filtered through gaps in the walls, illuminating dust motes and pale shafts. Louise sat bound to her chair, exhaustion etched on her face but determination still burning in her eyes. Samuel Carter spun around at the sound, pistol drawn, while Edwin rose from his seat by the cold hearth. "That's far enough, McCready," Samuel barked, hammer cocked. Ronald held up empty hands, the Bible cradled in one palm. "I came unarmed. There's something you need to hear." "We don't need to hear anything from you," Edwin sneered, but his voice held a tremor of uncertainty. Ronald stepped forward deliberately, placing the Bible on the rough-hewn table. Its leather cover bore the marks of years of faithful reading. "This isn't about guns or threats anymore. It's about truth." He opened the Bible with careful reverence, drawing out a folded paper sealed with wax. The morning light caught the broken seal as he unfolded it. "These are Thomas Holt's last words, written the week before he died." Ronald's voice filled the small space, steady and clear. "I reckon you boys should hear what a dying man had to say about his daughter in that spring." Samuel's pistol wavered. More lies won't change anything. But Ronald began to read. "To whom it may concern, I, Thomas Holt, being of sound mind and failing body, do hereby affirm that the deed to the northern spring was lawfully purchased and registered. I set this down as my final testimony, knowing I must soon meet my maker." The words flowed like the spring itself, clear and true. Thomas wrote of his dreams for the water to serve all people, regardless of birth or blood. He spoke of his pride in Louise's strength and wisdom, and he addressed the whispers about her mother's heritage directly. "Let no man shame my daughter for the blood that flows in her veins. Her mother was a woman of grace and dignity, and Louise carries that same spirit. The spring's waters run pure for all God's children." Louise's soft weeping filled the pauses as Ronald read. The morning light grew stronger, throwing the brothers' faces into sharp relief. Samuel's hand trembled on his pistol, while Edwin seemed to age before their eyes. "Lies," Samuel spat, but his voice cracked. "All lies." He raised his pistol higher, finger tightening on the trigger. "Stop!" Louise cried out, straining against her bonds. "God sees your cruelty. He knows what's in your hearts." Edwin suddenly staggered, bracing himself against the wall. "We can't," he whispered. "We can't keep doing this, Samuel." "Shut your mouth," Samuel turned on his brother, face twisted with rage and fear. But Edwin straightened, years of buried truth rising to the surface. "Our own mother was Cherokee," he confessed, voice breaking. "We've been living a lie, brother. Hating Louise for the same blood that flows in our veins." The confession hung in the air like thunder. Samuel's pistol dropped to his side as if it had suddenly grown too heavy to hold. "She made us swear never to tell," Edwin continued, tears tracking down his weathered face. "Said the shame would destroy our family. But the real shame is what we've done to hide it." Ronald set the letter down gently. "There's a way to end this without more pain," he said softly. "No one needs to know about your mother. But you have to make this right." "How?" Samuel asked, all fury drained from his voice. "I returned to town. Tell the judge you lied about Thomas Holt's drinking. Admit you threatened Louise to steal her deed." Ronald's eyes held firm but compassionate. Let the truth about the spring come out, and the rest can stay buried. The brothers looked at each other, decades of shared secrets passing between them. Finally, Edwin nodded. It's time, Samuel. We can't keep running from who we are. Samuel's shoulders slumped. He tucked his pistol into his holster with trembling hands. Do it, he whispered to Ronald, before I change my mind. Ronald crossed to Louise, drawing his knife to cut her bonds. The ropes fell away, leaving angry marks on her wrists. She collapsed into his arms, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. It's over, he murmured, holding her close. You're safe now. They walked out of the shack together into the fresh morning light. The valley spread before them, transformed by the dawn. Dew sparkled on every blade of grass, and birdsong filled the air with praise. The spring burbled nearby, its waters catching the sun like liquid silver. Ronald marveled at how everything had changed, not through force or violence, but through truth spoken in love. The power of mercy had broken chains stronger than iron. Edwin and Samuel mounted their horses, shame bowing their shoulders. We'll ride straight to town, Edwin promised. Make things right with the judge. Louise watched them go, then turned to Ronald. Thank you, she whispered, for choosing a better way. He smiled gently, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I had a good teacher. Someone showed me that faith and truth are stronger than any weapon. They stood together in the morning light, watching the brothers disappear down the trail. The spring's waters sang their endless song, no longer a source of strife, but a promise of healing for all who would drink deep of mercy's flow. The courthouse buzzed with whispers as townsfolk packed the wooden benches. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Louise sat straight-backed beside Ronald, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Samuel and Edwin Carter stood before the judge, their shoulders slumped. We lied about Thomas Holt, Edwin confessed, his voice carrying through the hushed room. He was never a drunk. We threatened his daughter to steal the deed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Samuel kept his eyes fixed on the floor, nodding in silent agreement. Reverend Yates rose next, his weathered Bible tucked under one arm. I knew Thomas Holt for 15 years, he declared firmly. He was a man of integrity who loved this community. That spring was his legacy to his daughter. Ronald stepped forward, presenting the letter they had found. The judge adjusted his spectacles, examining the careful handwriting and unbroken seal. His eyes moved slowly across each line as the room held its breath. The railroad agent, Horace Bell, pushed through the crowd. Your Honor, our offer still stands. The railway will pay handsomely for those water rights. The judge held up his hand for silence. Having reviewed all evidence, I find this deed valid and binding. The spring belongs to Miss Louise Holt. The crowd erupted in exclamations. Louise rose slowly to her feet, her voice clear and steady. The spring will not be sold, she announced. My father meant it for everyone's use, and so it shall remain. Applause broke out from several corners. Other faces showed shame, eyes downcast. The rejected groom slipped out the back door, followed by jeers and pointing fingers. Ronald took Louise's hand openly as they walked down the courthouse steps. Men who had once turned away now removed their hats in respect. Widow Jenkins wiped tears from her eyes, while the young farmhand who had chopped their wood grinned broadly. Outside, sunshine sparkled on puddles left by a week of rain. The fresh-washed air carried the scent of spring flowers and new beginnings. Your father would be mighty proud, Ronald whispered, squeezing her hand gently. Louise smiled through glistening tears, her face radiant with vindication. His truth prevailed, she said softly. And now everyone knows it. Spring sunshine bathed the little whitewashed church in golden light. A week had passed since the courthouse victory, and now the building hummed with joyful activity. Women moved through the chapel carrying wild mountain flowers and fresh-cut blooms from their gardens, arranging them in mason jars along the windowsills. Children darted between the pews, hanging colored ribbons from hooks while their mothers called out gentle directions. The worn wooden floors had been swept clean, and fresh hay scattered outside the church steps to keep the mud at bay. In Widow Jenkins's front room, Louise bent over her wedding dress, carefully removing the torn seams that held such bitter memories. Her fingers worked steadily with thread and needle, incorporating the delicate lace the widow had gifted her. "This was from my own wedding day," Martha Jenkins had said, pressing the carefully preserved fabric into Louise's hands. At his cabin, Ronald sat by lamplight, meticulously carving 2 silver coins into rings. His strong hands, usually more familiar with axe and rifle, moved with surprising gentleness as he shaped the metal into circles that would bind their lives together. When the wedding day dawned clear and bright, the little church filled quickly. Settler families in their Sunday best sat alongside Cherokee relatives in traditional dress, all welcomed warmly by Reverend Yates at the door. The pews creaked under the weight of the fullest congregation anyone could remember. Louise stood in the back, taking deep breaths. Her restored gown gleamed in the morning light, its new lace catching the sun. As the first notes of a hymn filled the air, she walked down the aisle with measured steps and head held high. Ronald waited at the altar, shifting nervously in his cleaned and pressed suit, his eyes never leaving Louise's face. When they joined hands, his calloused fingers trembled slightly against her soft ones. Their vows rang out clear and true in the hushed church. "I do," they each said simply, and many in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Outside, long tables groaned under the weight of shared dishes, fresh bread, pots of beans, and platters of roasted venison. For the first time in living memory, Settler and Cherokee families passed plates back and forth, sharing food and conversation as equals. A fiddle struck up a lively tune, and children from both communities joined hands, dancing in the spring grass. Ronald and Louise stood hand in hand, watching their neighbors laugh and celebrate together. In their eyes shone the light of a new beginning, built on forgiveness and hope. The mountain air grew crisp as Ronald guided the wagon up the familiar trail toward home. Louise sat close beside him, her wedding dress rustling softly in the gathering dusk. As they crested the final ridge, their cabin came into view, its windows glowing with the warm lamplight Ronald had carefully prepared that morning. He helped Louise down from the wagon, her hand steady in his as she stepped onto land that was now truly theirs together. Inside, the cabin felt different, no longer a hermit's refuge but a home filled with promise. The flames in the hearth cast dancing shadows on the log walls as Louise reverently placed her father's Bible and the hard-won deed on the wooden mantel. Ronald's gaze lingered on his rifle, the faithful companion of his solitary years. With deliberate steps, he crossed the room and leaned it in the corner near the door. "Reckon I won't be needing this quite so much anymore," he said softly, turning to Louise. "Found something stronger than iron to guard us now. Faith and family." Louise's eyes shone in the firelight as she set out their wedding supper on the rough-hewn table. Simple fare, bread, cheese, and preserved fruit. But it felt like a feast as they shared quiet laughter between bites, remembering moments from their celebration. The first snowflakes of evening began drifting past the windows, thick and gentle. Ronald rose and wrapped a patchwork quilt around Louise's shoulders, his voice rough with emotion. "Can't help but thank the Lord for that day I heard you in the woods," he whispered, "even if it broke my heart to find you chained to that tree." Louise leaned into his embrace, her fingers intertwining with his. "Providence freed us both that day," she replied softly. "You from your loneliness, me from my chains." Together they stood at the window watching the snow blanket their valley in pristine white. The cabin that had known so many silent nights now hummed with warmth and life. Their shared breath fogged the glass as they held each other close, two hearts finally finding harbor after the storm. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.